Postman Pat's Breakdown. Postman Pat was driving along singing a song to Jess when the engine of his van began to make strange noises. It went splutter, pop, bang, splutter, whiz, squeak, fizz, buzz, rattle, or something rather like that. Pat stopped singing and looked worried. "Oh dear," he said, "that sounds bad. We can't do with having a breakdown with all these letters to deliver. Come on, don't stop." But the van wasn't listening. It began to go more slowly. No matter how hard Pat pressed his foot down, it began to go along in jerks, stopping and starting again. The engine began to cut out. Then it gave a last cough, backfired with a loud bang that frightened the sheep, and stopped. Pat pressed the starter. There was a whirring sound, but the engine was dead. They were stuck. "Now what are we going to do?" said Pat. "We haven't delivered a single letter." Jess thought it was a good chance to get out and hunt for mice and rabbits along the hedge. Pat opened the bonnet and looked at the engine. It looked just the way it always looked. He looked at the dipstick. The oil was all right. He made sure there were no loose wires. He poked about for a while, then tried the starter again. It was no good. The engine had definitely decided to take a holiday. Pat looked up and down the road. All was quiet. They were a long way from any farms or houses. "Someone's sure to come along sooner or later," said Pat. He sat in the van and read his Pencaster Gazette. After some time Pat heard the tingling of a bicycle bell and a whirring of wheels and pedals. Then he saw Miss Hubbard's hat sailing along above the hedge. She came round the corner and almost ran into the van. "Good gracious, Pat," she said, "whatever are you doing sitting here? Are there no letters today?" Pat told her about his breakdown. She had a look at his engine. It sounds as though you've blown a gasket," she said. "Or else your big end's gone. I once had a Riley that did that, in the middle of nowhere. You'll need a tow. I'll pop in at the Pottages and see if Peter Fogg's about. Won't be long." "Just a minute," said Pat. "I think I have some letters for you." He rummaged in his bag and brought out 3 letters and a small parcel. "Lovely. Thanks, Pat. Bye." And off she went. Whilst Pat was waiting, the milk tanker came along. It was George Lancaster's cousin Tim driving it. He couldn't get past Pat's van. He had to stop and help Pat to push the van into the side of the road to make room. "Hang on a minute," said Pat. "There's a letter for George and a card and a Pools coupon for you." "Thanks," said Tim. "Cheers." Jess came back with his fur all ruffled up and with twigs and leaves tangled in it. "I think I've found a new way to deliver letters," said Pat. "If we sit here long enough, everyone will come past. I'll just give them their letters as they pass by. It would save a lot of petrol, and you could hunt mice all day, Jess." Pat read another page of the paper. Then there was the sound of a tractor coming along the road. It was Peter Fogg, complete with tow rope. "Well, I'm glad to see you," said Pat. "Here we are, 3 letters, a magazine, your tax form, and an advert for soap powder. Oh yes, and a broken-down van. I'm sorry to bother you." "Don't mention it," said Peter. "It's no bother at all. Let's get it out at road." Peter soon had the rope hitched up, and it didn't take long to tow Pat to Greendale Farm. "We'll just push it in the barn, and I'll have a look at it," said Peter, "while you have a cup of tea." Mrs. Pottage had the tea ready for Pat. He brought his bag of post in with him, as he had a lot of letters for the Pottage family, and 2 parcels as well. Then Peter came in with bad news. "You'll need a new engine," he said. "Oh dear," said Pat. "That means getting it towed in to Pencaster. I expect the post office will lend me a spare till it's mended."
"But what will you do about today's post?" said Mrs. Pottage. "You could have borrowed Herbert's Land Rover, but he's gone off in it to buy some sheep."
"I'm just going to stand at the roadside till everybody comes past," said Pat. "But it might take a long time."
"I know," said Mrs. Pottage. "You can borrow my bike. It only needs the tyres pumping up, and it'll be fine."
A little while later, Pat set out again on Mrs. Pottage's bike. Jess sat in the basket at the front, and the bag of letters was tied on the carrier at the back. It was hard work pedalling up the hills, and Jess was cold in the basket. Oh, how they longed for their warm van! The bike jolted along the bumpy roads, and as they went along it seemed to get more bumpy and more jolty. When they stopped at the church, Pat saw why. The front wheel had a slow puncture, and it was quite flat by now. "I'll just pump it up," said Pat. Then he saw that there was no pump on the bike. Peter had pumped it up with the van's foot pump. "Now what?" said Pat. "I wonder if the Reverend has a pump." Pat gave a lot of letters to the Reverend Timms, and this made his bag much lighter. "I'm sorry, Pat," said the Reverend. "I haven't got a pump. I always use the one at the garage in Pencaster, but I can give you a lift in my car. I have to go and see Ted about repairing the organ." "That's very kind of you," said Pat. It was quite a long job getting the Reverend's car out. It was a very old Morris Minor. There was something wrong with the gears, and it wouldn't go backwards, so they had to push it out of the garage. Then the Reverend couldn't find the key, until he remembered that he had hidden it under a vase of tulips in the vestry. Then it wouldn't start. Pat had to push it until they came to a hill. Then he had to jump in quickly, and it started at last, with a roar and clouds of blue smoke. Pat was on his way again, and Jess was much warmer, curled up on the back seat. Ted was surprised to see Pat arriving with the Reverend, but pleased to have his letters, even if they were so very late. Pat told the story of his breakdown. As they were talking, there was the sound of an engine coming up the road. Ted ran outside to stop whoever it was. "Come on, Pat," he shouted. "It's Alf with his trailer. He can give you a lift up to Thompson Ground." So off went Pat and Jess again, jolting and jouncing on Alf's trailer this time. I don't know what had been on Alf's trailer that morning, but it was very smelly. When they arrived at Thompson Ground, Dorothy was cross with Alf and said that he should have given Jess and Pat a clean piece of sacking to sit on. Never mind. Pat delivered more letters and parcels, and his bag was still lighter.
"Now, where is your next call, Pat?" said Dorothy.
"Granny Dryden," said Pat. "Well, that's a good way," said Alf. "Too far to walk, really."
"Well, I wonder," said Dorothy. "I wonder if Pat could ride our pony. Miss Hubbard lives near Granny Dryden, and she has a stable. You could leave it there if you can get another lift home."
Pat wasn't so sure about this idea. He hadn't been on a pony for years and years, and Jess had never been on one.
"She's a good, quiet creature," said Dorothy. "You'll be all right with our Lizzie."
Pat decided he would give it a try. He had never missed delivering the post yet, not once, and he hoped to win the Postman of the Year competition in the post office newspaper. Yes, he would have a try. So with a clip-clop of hooves, Pat set out again up the steep road from Thompson Ground. Jess was tucked into his coat, out of the way. All went well until Pat decided to take a short cut to Granny Dryden's cottage.
"There's no need to keep to the road on a horse," said Pat. "It'll be much quicker if we go across the fields." So Pat left the road and set out across the field. Lizzie was a good and quiet horse, true enough, but Dorothy hadn't thought to tell Pat that she was scared of crossing streams. She had thought he would stay on the road. So when they came to a stream, Lizzie would not cross it. She walked sideways and backwards and round in circles, but she would not cross the water. No matter how Pat asked her, or pulled at the reins, or patted her neck, she still wouldn't cross the water. Then, with all this turning and stepping up and down at the edge of the water, Lizzie put her foot in a rabbit hole. This gave her a fright, so that she reared up, tipping Pat and Jess and the bag of letters all into the water, with a great splash. Pat struggled to hold the letters out of the water, and Lizzie ran off back to Thompson Ground. Jess hung on to Pat's shoulder with all his claws, to keep his paws dry. Pat was wet and muddy. What a mess! Luckily, the water was only a few inches deep, but it was very, very cold. Pat sloshed out and up the hill to Granny Dryden's cottage. There was a shiny red Sierra standing outside Granny Dryden's cottage. "That looks like Dr. Gilbertson's car," said Pat to Jess, as they squelched up to the door.
"Good gracious me, Pat! Have you been for a swim?"
said Granny Dryden when she opened the door.
"You've picked a cold day for it. You should wait till summer."
Tissue," said Pat.
"Into that bathroom with you," said Dr. Gilbertson, "and get those wet clothes off before you catch your death of cold. We'll find you something dry to put on. You better get into a hot bath while you're about it." But what could they find for Pat to wear at Granny Dryden's house? Jess was soon all right. He gave himself a good wash, then sat by Granny Dryden's warm fire to dry out. But what about Pat? Granny Dryden opened her wardrobe and rummaged through her drawers, but there was nothing that Pat could wear.
"We can't send him walking his rounds in a dress," said Dr. Gilbertson. "The only thing we can do is to wrap him in some blankets." So they warmed some spare blankets in front of the fire, and handed them into the bathroom to Pat. He came out looking like a Roman in a film. Granny Dryden laughed so much that Dr. Gilbertson said he had done her much more good than all her bottles of medicine. The letters were only a little damp. There were quite a few for the two ladies, and the bag was getting almost empty. Pat sorted out the remaining letters on the table.
"I'm calling at all those places on my rounds," said Dr. Gilbertson, "so you can ride with me. It'll do my patients good to see you. They need a good laugh. We'd better be on our way. Goodbye, Mrs. Dryden. I'll see you next week."
Pat and Dr. Gilbertson were on their way. It was just as the doctor had said. Pat made such a comical sight, wrapped up in his blankets, that everyone they visited felt much better afterwards.
"You can come with me every day if you like," said Dr. Gilbertson. "I think I'll put you on my list of medicines. Only, if you make everyone better, there'll be no work for me to do."
The next day the post office said Pat could use another van until his own was mended, and he wore his spare uniform. Even though he didn't look funny now, he still cheered people up when he called with their letters and parcels, and stopped for a chat and a joke and to swap all the news of the valley.